Nothing particularly unusual about that June 30th, 1945. Subways, railroad terminals, and ferry boats discovered office-bound millions. Women went about their housework and later their day's shopping. Part of this normal life was newspapers, taken as a matter of course by everyone. So regular and complete a part of normal everyday living that finding newspapers on the newsstands, buying them morning and night, was taken pretty much for granted. Never a thought of the rumbling presses that produced them, completely oblivious to the vast transportation system that placed them so conveniently on 14,000 strategically located newsstands throughout the city. No reason to contemplate what life without newspapers would mean, until suddenly and with little warning, strike. 1,700 delivery men ceased work. Newspaper trucks stopped rolling. Newsstands formerly piled high with 8 daily New York newspapers were devoid of newspapers, devoid of customers, barren as a desert waste. With the lone exception of PM, newsstands were as bare as Mother Hubbard's cupboard. Discussion has raged pro and con. Will radio eventually supplant newspapers? Isn't it easier to turn a switch than to read an editorial? Yes, for radio, here was a heaven-sent opportunity, but something was lacking. An appetizer is a poor substitute for a full meal. A starving man languishes on a Hollywood diet. Radio was apparently not the right answer. Newspaper readers telephoned in and discovered that despite pickets, newspapers were still being published every day. Learned they could obtain copies by going directly to the newspaper plant. Here is the Herald Tribune plant on the first day of the strike, showing the truck loading platform used to sell papers in the emergency. The first day of the strike, Herald Tribune circulation plummeted to 15,000. But as more and more loyal Tribune readers learned they could buy the paper at the plant, they went to the Herald Tribune in ever-increasing numbers. On the last day of the strike, the Herald Tribune sold 65,000 copies, by far the greater portion of them in direct over-the-counter sales to Tribune readers who had taken the time and trouble to come far out of their way to get a copy of their favorite morning newspaper.
So a lot to react to in that. Let's just talk first about the size of that radio in that guy's living room. You could sleep a small family in there, I think. But it must have had tremendous bass. Radios, though, very passé. Let's talk about television. Most of us have never met and will never meet a president, but we have all had several of them in our living rooms. We've watched them give speeches and throw baseballs, heard them chuckle and choke back tears, witnessed moments of political triumph and personal tragedy. Since FDR became the first president to appear on the small screen at the 1939 World's Fair, not far from here, television has been key to presidential power and a factor in, read my lips here, some presidents' demise. Now we have a president with a history in reality TV, but whose real love is Twitter, raising the question of whether the power of social media will finally trump that of the tube. Here to flip through the presidential TV highlight reel and look ahead is Catherine Fry, chair of the Department of TV and Radio at Brooklyn College. Professor Fry, welcome.
Thank you.
We're talking about this as part of this week-long focus on the press and the president. Do you think the history reflects TV as a tool of the press in covering the president, or primarily as a way that presidents have circumvented the press to talk right to the people?
That's a really complicated question. So let me just begin by saying that what's really interesting to me is, and kind of going back to the video that we were watching earlier, it's interesting to watch the trajectory of news and information from sort of the print era of the 19th century, back when people were reading newspapers and the newspaper industry became really was a booming industry and the go-to place for news. And then into the 20th century, where you have the beginning of radio and broadcasting, the electronic era ushered in a whole new way of getting information, of understanding what was going on, and then it became a new tool for not only presidents but everybody to use to sort of like get their message across. So I guess to answer your question, I would say if we're just focusing on the president, which is our focus today, yes, so the presidents needed to adapt their style of communication to fit the new electronic era. And radio was the beginning of that.
Right,
okay.
FDR's fireside chats.
Yeah, exactly.
So
all of a sudden you had this medium that collapsed space, right? And time, really. And then, you know, they could reach many, many people at one time, and it didn't require it didn't require reading. Newspapers didn't die out, even though newspapers were very worried about their future with the onset of radio, but they negotiated something in there. But then came television. And then came, you know, Walter Cronkite, and then came, you know, the characteristics of television, which are visual variety, sounds, sound bites. And it's not just television, but it's the television industry, which, you know, with its heavy time constraints and these new genres and all of that. So that...
And JFK, really, the first president who really mastered that. He mastered that even before becoming president. And famously, we'll watch a clip now of one of his debates with Richard Nixon, where Nixon won on radio and JFK won on television. Let's take a quick look.
Excellent, yeah.
Oh, that's President Reagan. Let's talk about President Reagan instead.
Sure, that's fine. So
here, let's listen to Sam Donaldson.
Because for many years I was a Democrat. I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
So JFK and Reagan, different in many ways, but similar in that they had this ability to, presidents who were not, let's say, uniformly recognized for their intellectual acumen, but were able to show their wit, their humor, their charm. That was the genius, right?
It was the genius. So just a few words about JFK. So he was the first what I call telegenic president, meaning that he looked good. On television, you're required to look good, right? I mean, we were just back there putting makeup on, right?
It's quite clear.
I mean, it's about looking, and it's about the sound also. You can't take that away from it. And it's about like editing. It's like the visual variety. So JFK, whether he really understood it or not, was the telegenic guy. And then Nixon failed miserably. You know, intellectual acumen wasn't enough to do it. And it wasn't until the early 1980s, so when we had Reagan. And he was, you know, it's no mistake that he was our first actor president. And actually, if you look back, it makes perfect sense that we had an actor as a president. From the early 60s until 80 was enough of a cultural lag time for television to become very well established as the tool of our cultural conversation, to quote Neil Postman, who wrote this very important book in 1985 called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where it's, you know, it's political discourse in the television age or something. I have the last part of that wrong. But basically what he's saying is that television encourages feeling and not thinking. Television encourages us to look, but not to really have to be logical and to connect ideas. So a Nixon would like never fly today.
And television also has this, especially for a president who's good at manipulating it, a moment that might seem to be off the cuff or unscripted is in fact not. And JFK knew what he was doing in that debate. Reagan practiced all those jokes. Apparently he had index cards full of them. So sort of the spontaneous moment that is actually quite well practiced. And then Reagan took it, I think, a step further in creating really the sound bite, right? The moment. And let's look at the famous one at the gate in East Berlin.
Yeah.
Can we show that clip? Anyway, to paraphrase, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, or Mr. Gorbachev, as he pronounced it, tear down this wall. Nobody knows anything in the rest of that speech, but it was brilliant, right? Creating the moment.
Right. Television does not require historical context. Television doesn't even require context at all. It just requires, like, the now, like what feels good and what sounds good right now. And news programs, Reagan was very smart. News programs.
Oh, here we go. Sorry.
Okay,
Here's...
Sure, that's fine.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
and they eat it up. And most people, that's all they ever saw that speech.
Yeah, and
right?
then you know, the camera cuts to the crowd, and everybody's going wild, and then you feel good. It's about feeling. It's all about the feeling. Yes, it was very tightly scripted. Television was very tightly scripted, down to the last moment. But that's all changing now.
It started changing, I think, if I'm not wrong, around the time of Reagan's presidency, and especially as it transited to his successor, the first President Bush, in the rise of cable networks, the 24-hour news cycle.
Yep.
How did that change the game for presidents?
Oh, it changed it enormously because, you know, again, you have to look at the industry and the development of the industry. All of a sudden, there are like huge gaps that needed to be filled. And all this time. And so television was really experimenting again with, okay, what is information going to look like? How is information going to be shaped in what is still television, but television that now is on many different outlets, and it's on 24/7. Allegedly, right? Maybe not right at the beginning, but shortly thereafter. So all of a sudden, you know, you have like C-SPAN, and all of a sudden you have like people experimenting with ways in which to shape information to fill all of that. But it was still pretty tightly scripted. But all of that changes in the digital era. Okay, a lot of the hierarchies become collapsed in the digital era. With the onset of the internet, all of a sudden you don't have the need to have the strict hierarchies of news organizations like you had before. It's a little bit of a free-for-all, right? And even though it's still about how you look and what you sound like, and it's still very much driven by emotions, the new thing now in the digital era is the collapsing of the hierarchy. And that sort of like old TV broadcast industry model for news and information.
In terms of presidents losing control, what's interesting to me from going back to the first President Bush, his famous speech to the convention in '88, where he uttered a promise related to tax cuts or tax hikes, that he viewed as a controlled moment, but it became something altogether different. Can we watch that clip of the reading of the lips?
My lips. No new taxes.
Barbara, it's good to see her again. So that becomes instant accountability, right? He said it, and not only did you read it or hear it, but you saw him.
He wasn't thinking about the era of archiving. Right. He wasn't thinking. I mean, he's a gentleman from the older days, where I mean, the old TV days where you catch their attention with a pithy phrase. He got that, but he was way behind the curve when it came to like understanding that this could come back to haunt him. And
then you have the totally unscripted moment. It's his famous, I guess it was a state dinner in Japan, where the president became ill. Can we watch that? It's before lunchtime, so can we watch the president vomiting on?
The lone camera in the dining room was locked in on the head table when President Bush was overcome by nausea and fell forward. It appears he lost consciousness as he toppled over onto his host, Prime Minister Miyazawa.
If you watch the full clip, and we'll put that up elsewhere, the worst part is when he kind of bounces at the end and says, you know, my bad, sorry about that.
He had the presence of mind to understand that he was being watched, and he had to, like, you know,
kind of exit
pull
quickly.
it together.
But so there is the uncontrolled moment occasion when the cameras are running, right? And that's come back to haunt some presidents.
Yeah, and back then, that was a big deal. I don't know that's such a big deal now. You know, back then that was like not supposed to happen because there was a certain amount of decorum around the presidency that we just expected, which we'd sort of always had an idea about. But television started eroding that a long, long time ago. It just didn't reach its full erosion until, you know, the digital era was firmly cemented.
There's been this back and forth, right, of presidents controlling this medium and then kind of losing control. And you had President H.W. Bush, let's face it, not so good at the talking, but good at looking strong, walking in a muscular fashion. And so you had scenes like the famous Mission Accomplished aircraft carrier scene, very stage managed. And that was sort of his area of expertise, right? Creating the moment where you didn't even have to talk to convey a message.
Right, and lucky for him, he didn't have to talk. Again, you know, it made sense for a person like him to be elected when he was elected because he didn't have to be an intellectual powerhouse. And, you know, history shows us that he was not, but he knew how to play to the camera, and he was, you know, had the legacy of his father, and he had that whole waspy thing still going on.
Right.
Right? I mean, which we have a really hard time getting rid of until Obama was elected finally.
Right. And what was Obama's approach to the TV
So
screen?
Obama was like the full package, in my opinion. I mean, he was like a breath of fresh air. He was intellectual, he was media savvy, he got pop culture. He understood popular culture, he had a great sense of humor, and he understood the importance of having a great sense of humor in the era of electronic media. He was also the first president to sort of usher in the digital presidency. I mean, he was the first one to realize that young people were a base that he needed to reach, and he could reach them very well via the web. Social media weren't quite as heavily embedded when he was first elected in 2008, but
Now, his successor is Mr. Social Media, is a big tweeter. And what is that? How does that change the interaction with the audience, do you think?
Okay, so much to talk about there. So Donald Trump is Mr. Reality TV. Again, you have to look at it historically. It makes perfect sense. As loath as we are to say it, it makes sense that Donald Trump is elected now because we are heavily embedded in the era of social media. Reality television is a perfectly acceptable forum for us to discuss who we are and to sort of play out our politics. He's sort of the president of the digital era.
Definitely, and we're watching.
Sadly.
I'm sure he's tweeting about us right now, I have no doubt.
You know, I would be thrilled.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. We'll be tuning in for this conversation as President Trump redefines the relationship between presidents and the press.